Hi, Suzanne. This background looks terrible. You want to say hi to Mia? Yeah. Hi, Mia. Somebody wants to say hi. Hi, Mia.
Oh, hello.
How are you?
I'm good.
How's it going?
It's been going, so it's so nice to see you again.
It's so nice to see you, too. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to join tonight, but Angela will keep me updated.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Good to see you guys.
Yes. Yes.
How is everyone this evening? Hot? At last?
Pleasantly warm.
It's hot in my office here. It's sun. It must be south facing. I'm not complaining too much, though. How's it going for you, Chris? Busy?
Good, yeah, we're still moving though.
Pardon me?
Still moving though.
It's a really busy time of the year.
Yeah.
So I'll give folks a few more minutes. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi. I'm going to get going in about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, welcome everyone. Let's get started. My name is Angela Elkordy, and I'm Assistant Professor of Learning Sciences and co-chair of our Learning Sciences and Education Department. So this evening, we're going to explore the science of learning and what that means. We do have folks that are from the NLU, National Louis University community and beyond that. So just a couple of housekeeping tips for right now. So if you're new to Zoom, please mute unless you're speaking. Use the chat feature. Just a heads up that this meeting is being recorded. And you can follow along at this URL. So that's tinyw.in/2QZN. So this evening, we're going to talk about the why, the science of learning, about the growing interest in the science of learning and where it came from, what is the science of learning, some helpful ideas for instruction, teaching, and learning from the learning sciences, and I'll show you where to learn more through resources I've assembled. and I'll invite you to take a quiz on common misconceptions about the brain and learning. So first of all, let's just take a second or two, a couple of minutes to introduce ourselves. So as you know, my name is Angela Elkordy. I've been at National Louis University for 5 years. I teach graduate and doctoral level courses, and I love to share about the learning sciences and writing a book about that, which is due to be published in June. So full disclosure, this presentation is around ideas from a course that I teach called Introduction to Learning Sciences and Technology, and we're in the process of writing a book that will be published by ISTE. So if you could unmute, and if you don't mind, I'll just quickly call your name. If you could say a couple of sentences about you and your work, that would be great. So I've got on my display, Chris Beadle is first. Sorry.
Everybody, I'm a high school Spanish teacher. I'm also in my my last term in the Learning Technologies program at National Louis with a instructional coaching major.
Thank you. Mia?
Hi, my name is Mia, and I am an instructional technology specialist at an elementary school district, and I completed my own Master's of Technology and Education at National Louis University this past June 2018.
Thank you. Ian?
Hi, good evening, everybody. Ian Moncrief. I'm an assistant professor of science at the undergraduate college at National Louis University. I teach freshman biology and physical science, as well as the student success seminar. So happy to be here.
Welcome. Suzanne?
Hi, I'm Suzanne Martinez, National College of Education, Curriculum and Instruction, and I actually spent the last 22 years with Chicago Public Schools as an instructional technology person, and had a great time at it. Loved every day of it. Been at National for 14 years, and I love Angela's presentation, so that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Welcome. Doug?
Everyone, I'm Doug Van Dyke. I come by way of 22 years in the mostly 9th grade ELA classroom, and started off working on a master's in ed tech, and have since shifted to the curriculum advocacy and policy doctoral program. Yeah, and have had Angela before, and also love her presentations, and so got the last minute word. We're here tonight, so I thought I'd jump in.
Welcome. And Cheryl?
Hi, I'm Cheryl Bulett. I am an adjunct faculty for National Louis in the Undergraduate College of Early Childhood Education.
Welcome. And we won't ask Barbara to introduce herself unless you're able to unmute quickly. Barbara, we're all introducing ourselves. Sorry to surprise you. I saw you just joined us. Still setting up. Okay. So thank you, everyone. So just a heads up, here's where you're going to find many of the resources for further exploration, and some of the resources that we'll talk about in the context of this presentation. This is a Pearl Trees collection, and the link is at the end of the slide, so it's really important that you have the slides. And if you do not have the link, just go back to follow along, or you can email me at elkordy@nl.edu, and I'll send you the link. So what is the science of learning? It's been called the learning sciences, but now the term has shifted a little bit because there's more widespread interest in how do people learn. So the learning sciences is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary kind of umbrella area of study that covers a lot of different fields. So the learning sciences itself started out as an area of inquiry in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And the reason that it came about is that traditionally, not by planning, but it just happened that educational research was very disconnected from educational practice. So meaning that by necessity, educational researchers tried to isolate one or two factors that so they could really determine a causal relationship as to why one thing was causing another. Whereas in real life, in naturalistic settings, in the classroom, it's impossible to isolate phenomena and study them in depth. So out of a sense of this disconnect, a few researchers started looking and doing research actually in classrooms. And this is called, or came to be called, design-based research. And that simply means taking a design view of instruction and learning interventions and running through cycles and modifying them, which is very much in line with teacher practice. The main impetus for the learning sciences and the investigation of the learning sciences was really to think about how do people learn? And the focus is on the learner. Now, this is really a paradigm shift because as teachers and educators, you know that usually the way that we tend to focus is more on our instructional strategies, the use of pedagogy, assessment for learning. But when you consider the learner and the learner variability, it becomes quite a different exercise. It's an entirely different lens. So the science of learning draws upon disciplines such as cognitive science, anthropology, assessment science, and instructional design, and many, many other, psychology, cognitive psychology, and where it all coalesces around this idea of learning. So why the science of learning? Well, as there's been more interest in the science of learning, there have been more publications that are making this material accessible to practitioners like you and I. For example, the National Academies in the year 2000 came out with this book, How People Learn. And it's all about evidence-based and research-based information about how people learn. The organization, the OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, did a huge study on learning and the brain because teachers are brain changers. And so it's interesting how teachers are not really taught about learning science and how people learn in their preparation. And so the OECD was one of the organizations that spearheaded this research into learning and the brain. McCrell, ISTE, and Edutopia, these are all organizations that publish for teacher practitioners and educators. You'll find some of them in the resources that I've mentioned. But the idea is that the learning sciences or the measurement of the impact of instructional practices specifically is really gaining traction within mainstream teaching practice. So why is that? Well, with the convergence, it's a convergence of a number of factors, but in particular, from my view, it really has a lot to do with the possibilities of technologies, digital tools and technologies to allow for more meaningful differentiation and personalization of learning content and the demand for it too. So I'm going to pause here for just a second. Are there any questions or comments?
Hi, Angela. Sorry I'm late.
No, not at all.
Technology problems. I do have a question about what impact technology has on the brain. I haven't really had a lot of time to look into that, but I know I'm concerned about what I see with not only my granddaughter, but younger generations, how they're losing a lot of their, like their handwriting and things like that. And I know that the brain is changing. I just wonder if you know anything about that.
I do. Could we talk about that in a little while? I think we're going to approach some topics that would lend itself to that conversation.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so moving on with the learning sciences are, as I said, they're becoming more interest to a widespread teaching and learning. And the International Society for Technology and Education, ISTE, is the national organization for educational or instructional technologies. And they set the standards for teachers, for students, for instructional coaches, for educators, for educational leaders, several different sets of national standards. And as part of their educator standards, they've included a standard that refers to the learning sciences and 1C. Stay current with the support research that supports improved student learning outcomes, including findings from the learning sciences. So now, because the ISTE standards are adopted very widely, you see that the educators are being held accountable to look at findings from the learning sciences. And as we briefly mentioned, this is the book that is coming out through which some of these ideas are articulated. So what findings are they talking about in ISTE? So there are several different buckets of information that the learning sciences might address. Impactful teaching and learning practices. So, what practices are impactful and why, and how do we know that, and how can we measure that? A huge one is learner variability. Now, this is, we all know that learners vary, and we know that prior knowledge is important, but by considering that how knowledge is built by individuals or constructed by individuals is so dependent upon that prior knowledge, and looking at it from kind of this science of learning perspective, you can see that it takes on a whole different level of importance. Looking at teaching as a design science. So in terms of instructional cycles, what we would do the planning for our outcomes, and then design activities or select activities that will get us to the outcomes, the specific outcomes that we would like to see. But not only that, we're going to measure, did it work? and not just as an assessment, but more in mind to inform the instruction and the next iteration. So it's not really a summative assessment, it's a formative assessment, and it's an approach to teaching that is iterative, building upon each cycle. And powerful instructional problem solving. So an example of that might be that your students are disengaged, and why might that be? Well, there's so many different reasons that that might be. And often teachers will say, well, you know, I can only do so much, and I can't engage them if they don't want to be engaged. But by taking a learner-centric position and thinking of this in terms of a design problem, you can use information from the learning sciences about learner motivation to try to engage the students more effectively. Ultimately, if the kid does not want to be engaged, they will not be engaged. But there are so many different steps to take before you reach that conclusion. So this is really interesting in that the Edutopia, which is a huge publisher of practitioner knowledge, is addressing this idea of bringing the science of learning into the classrooms. So this, I'm not going to play it here, but this is a whole series of articles, and there's a wonderful video as well. And Dr. Pamela Cantor is talking about an organization founded for and leveraging the science of learning and development. And what she is talking about, it's very interesting in this short clip, is about the idea of, well, what science do we pay attention to as practitioners? And the reason is there are a lot of misconceptions out there about how learning happens. So thinking about the science of learning, as we discussed, it means that we're shifting from thinking about how am I going to teach this to what is the most effective way for me to deliver this content so that students will take away what I want them to take away. Looks at how do people learn, and how do people learn from a very basic kind of level. For example, what are the roles of memory and attention? How are memories built? Considers how the learner variability piece, how everyone is different, and that includes thinking about the role of emotions, culture, the classroom context, the interactions between the students, and thinking about how people learn in different learning environments, formal and informal. So in thinking about, you know, how do people learn at home, the first thing that many of our students of any age would do is to go to the internet and look it up, right? So thinking about how learning happens in terms of the brain is kind of lazy, actually. Thinking is hard and it's effortful. So our brains are really designed to not think, to automate processes so that we don't have to do that effortful thinking very often. So remember what it was like when you were first learning how to drive. There were so many things to pay attention to. But over time, you learned more about how to drive, and you had to pay less attention. So that's, in general, how our brains work. the Hebbian principle about cells and that wire together, stay together. So the more that we learn, the more that we practice something, and automaticity becomes the goal there, and so that in our brains, the wires, the neural synapses are wired together so that for easy retrieval. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I didn't articulate that very well, and I just wonder if are there questions at this point?
This isn't so much a question as a comment, because I went to take a look at the Edutopia article that was mentioned, and there was the mention of the fight or flight response and how that's kind of an automated response. And I made this connection thinking about it's true, after skills are practiced to a certain extent, it becomes automatic, just like the fight or flight response is supposed to be automatic, because those kind of responses were based on, the survival of early humans. So I thought that was an interesting connection I wanted to share.
Thank you, Mia. Yes, absolutely. So in thinking about that, and that as an inbuilt hardwired response almost, this flight or fight, sometimes in the classroom that'll manifest itself in if students have had ACEs, which are adverse childhood events, or experienced trauma, you'll find them a little bit more reactive to criticism, or exhibiting, the enactment of this fight or flight, and you may not understand why. Why are they being so aggressive or uncooperative? And so that has been triggered, and that happens daily in classrooms. Anyone else? Thank you, Mia. So big ideas in the learning science. We've talked about the idea of learner variance and how do people vary. There's a whole project about that is being conducted by the good folks at Digital Promise. And the Learner Variability Project is something that you'll find on the resource list in Pearl Trees. The purposeful design of learning activities and environments, and this differs from lesson planning in that it's the intention. You're not just planning your activities and then having an assessment and recording the results. The way in which you approach it is you think, what are the best, given the time that I have and the resources, what are the best ways to help students understand these concepts? For example, using a strategy in science where students will articulate their conceptual models right off the bat. Just a small drawing, perhaps. How do you think this works? Okay, so by understanding how the student conceptualizes how something works, you can diagnose as a teacher whether or not the students have misconceptions. So that should be part of the teaching process if it's important for student understanding, because of course they can't build knowledge on faulty foundations or actually schema. And this idea of iteration and design-based research. So this is a big idea, but it can be implemented through small changes. For example, a colleague of mine was talking about looking at different ways collaboration happens in the classroom. And she was saying that, well, with this very small change, you could just changing the different groupings, maybe from heterogeneous to homogeneous level of groupings, what would the interaction effects be? And so that's a design element that you may wish to consider. And in the learning sciences, theory informs practice and vice versa. So some of the things that we might consider are the impact of culture and context, particularly if we think of a sociocultural model of learning that is heavily influenced by one's culture and prior knowledge. And through studying practice, you come up with informal theories. And so it's really important for teachers to do that, as well as educational researchers. So shifting a bit and thinking about learning and cognition and learner differences in this regard, we talked about the importance of prior knowledge. And the reason that this is so important is we talked also about how the brain doesn't like to think. It's effortful and hard, difficult. And you know yourself that it can be really challenging. So this idea of prior knowledge is key, because prior knowledge is how the brain organizes the information that it already has at hand. So in identifying a concept when we're learning, we're going to think, oh, that's kind of like X, Y, or Z. And so that will enhance and extend our learning, as opposed to when you have to build categories or schema right from scratch. So, and with misconceptions, it can be particularly damaging in that you might have to unlearn something. So our prior knowledge helps us to organize information and to make sense of it so that we can extend our knowledge. So because our brain is resistant against thinking, in the classroom and in life, you'll notice that we pay attention to novelty and surprise. And the reason is because once you get that automatic way of thinking, the brain is paying attention, it's monitoring the situation, but it really won't pay purposeful attention or direct attention unless something changes. So that's why novelty is very important, because it directs the learner's attention to the facts at hand. And the learning sciences also gives us tips about how to leverage cognition and principles of learning. For example, what are the best ways to study for a test? I think that most of our students cram a couple of hours before, but the learning science can tell us that actually our cognition works better through something called interleaving and retrieval practice. So interleaving just means, we might call that spaced practice as educators. And retrieval practice is important because the more that we retrieve facts from, I hope that's not, retrieve information, it means the more that we are actually building physical connections in our brains, and we can think about it from different perspectives. So these are just some of the concepts that we've talked about. So cognition, memory, attention. These are all important in the learning sciences. So teachers think about how people learn. They have always thought about how people learn. But sometimes there are misconceptions that are perpetuated because of misinformation or misunderstanding or misinterpretation. So that is what we would consider our neuromyths. So, for example, many of our students are surprised to learn that there is in fact no evidence for the use of students' preferred learning styles helps them to learn better. And this is often a really big shock for many pre-service teachers, because this idea is perpetuated. And there's no evidence to support that, though. Students may have preferences, but that doesn't mean that they learn better. The way to teach is to use the best modality for the content. So neuromyths are false beliefs about the brain. Another one is that we use 10% of our brain at any one time, which is not true. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Any questions, comments, something you'd like to share about how you see this playing out in your own teaching and learning context?
Yeah, Angela, I'm thinking, the more I hear you talk and the more I read and learn about the learning sciences and what neuroscience is telling us about ed psych, the more metacognitive practices and formative assessment practices seem to be really kind of key, powerful practices. And I don't like using that term because I think it takes on kind of this idea of a silver bullet, which I think we do too much, and it's a little dangerous. But when I've used them, and I think I've used them effectively, you can really see kids, rewiring and making new connections. And so just the more I think about it, the more I think those are really key elements. And when I say formative assessment, I mean, formative assessments, not interim assessments, which are just a term for a summative assessment that you give in the middle of the year, So that's where my thoughts are going right now.
Great, thank you, Doug. Anyone else?
I really like the term neuromyths. I think that is a great way to express misconceptions about how the brain works.
I can't take credit for that, but I like it too.
I was going to say something about second language learners because that's the population I deal with, and I'm always advising my teachers to use all the domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing together in a lesson because it helps to impact their language learning. And I know there's a lot of research on language and the brain, especially now that, research is going in so many directions with neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. The content area work around the neurosciences and the learning sciences is fascinating, but by using a few rather simple but powerful principles and translating those into strategies can make such a difference. So, for example, as Doug was saying about metacognition. So what is metacognition? Well, metacognition is thinking about thinking. Okay, but more specifically, it's thinking about your thinking. And it's a practice that is if developed, is so powerful. And it's this reflection piece. We're always told to be reflective educators and kind of think about, our practices. But for learners, this is a really great tool, and it's a wonderful way to encourage independence. So it sounds, it's research-based, and it has a lot of evidence-based to it as well. But in practice, it can be very simple. Asking questions. Well, how did you do that? Journals, asking them to reflect on the learning experience and the process of learning. Asking them to articulate in math, talk alouds. How did you get to this answer? And thinking that through, then the learner becomes owner of strategies that work and understand why they don't work. But such a powerful principle that can be very simple in implementation. Let's just go back to that slide just for a second. So thinking about effective instruction for learners, well, how do we know what makes a difference in terms of instruction? And so this has been the subject of quite a lot of research lately. And they're called, the most effective instructional practices are called different things by different researchers. So there's researchers out of the University of Michigan that are calling them high leverage practices, which just means that you get a lot of bang for your buck if you practice this way. There's a lot of evidence that they are, in fact, effective. And John Hattie is one of the more visible, pun intended, researchers in this area. So what John Hattie did originally about 10 years ago is that he did a meta-analysis of studies on educational research. So a meta-analysis basically just means he looked at approximately 80 to 100 articles, and he tried to understand from the analysis of the analyses, the research, what were the most influential factors on student achievement. So he's kept this going, and he's studied more and more of the research, and so he's come up with 250 influences now on student achievement. And so, but in conducting the meta-analysis, I'm trying to enlarge this book. I can't, sorry. In conducting the meta-analysis, he was looking at, what are the most impactful instructional practices? And the key here is there's some, you can see it if you look on the slide deck. The red are negative factors, and that would include, for example, parent military deployment, and those are student factors. There are also teaching and instructional factors as well. This is just a portion of the research, but for example, looking at phonics instruction that has an effect size of 0.07 or 0.70, sorry. So in his analysis, he ranked them using what the effect size. So that means the magnitude of the effect. And as John Hattie said, you could do almost anything in the classroom and kids would learn. But the purpose of his research and the idea of high leverage practices is understanding what are the most effective practices and practices are collections of teaching strategies, ways of thinking about how to convey content, a pedagogical approach, and kind of wrapping it all into this idea of a practice that teachers can develop over time. So this is the Teaching Works from the University of Michigan. And I think we're getting close to the end here. So I want to share with you the resources, the Getting Started for the Learning Sciences for Educators. That's the Pearl Trees collection. I invite you to join the fun and take the quiz on learning and the brain, and that's at this address here. And I will tell you this is anonymous, so you'll know how you scored, but nobody else will know it was you. And thinking about questions. What questions, comments? How does this relate to you and your practice? And we can go back to this idea, this discussion of how technology has changed our learners. So having listened to what I've said about, how the brain works, what it pays attention to is what gets learned. The idea that thinking is slow and effortful, and that the brain's goal is to automate these processes. What do you think is different about our digital age learners?
Well, I think a lot what I see in my classroom, since I mainly teach freshmen, incoming freshmen from CPS, is that in the technology age, right, their attention spans are a lot shorter because of these things, right? You can click on an app, you can see everything you want in a millisecond, and so when we have 3-hour classes, finding ways to break up lesson planning or in-class activities, I don't lecture for more than maybe 10-20 minutes, then I try and shift their focus somewhere else, and then I kind of go back to it again, because otherwise I find like they're just they want everything quick, easy, and so that's kind of a challenge. So I've tried even incorporating these in the classroom, using like my poll everywhere, like things like that, and it seems to be, I had some success for that, but that's what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing. Other ideas?
I've noticed in the classroom as a student that a lot of my peers just aren't curious enough to want to learn and to seek out that education. And I think that's the biggest block in the classroom for me and for others. Is just the students who choose to not participate and try to get out of work and try to get out of learning.
Well, that sounds to me like partially a motivation problem. What level students are you talking about? Is this undergrad?
I'm a junior in high school.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for joining us. Yes, but that's a very interesting idea, because it's an interaction of a lot of different factors. So teachers using appropriate ways of instruction to engage students. But as Ian has said, that his students want everything right away. Okay, so this is part of a much larger shift from, thinking in terms of what do we need to learn to be prepared for the 21st century. And there has been a big shift away from the ideas of learning content and facts. So students don't really like to do that as much unless it's integrated, such as in problem-based learning, learning just in time, learning that can incorporate their outside interests, so challenge-based learning. So it's difficult sometimes for teachers to find engaging ways to learn. And in high school, many of the students are coming to school and they already know, they know how they learn best. They go on the internet. They might ask their friends on Snapchat, or through polls or through Facebook, if they have a question about homework. So when you come into the classroom now, because we're in a very much a transition period, students have to essentially unlearn the ways that they have been successful in gaining information themselves and learn using other methods that may not be as natural to them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other thoughts?
I think that another consideration too is that there's still this, I don't want to just call it sort of generational, because even teachers who demographically are younger can find this a struggle. But I was testing out some devices with students in first grade, and they instantly were able to access the devices, use the various applications, and they were excited about using it. But from what I've encountered in various schools, there's this hesitancy. And I think what it comes down to, where it's possible some of the motivation issues might be due to the fact that for students now, it is the world you're in that this technology is accessible, and this technology is omnipresent in some ways. And as such, for educators who did not learn with the technology, there is sort of that struggle for how to properly bridge that gap, so to speak. Because some educators are, of course, very excited about incorporating novel activities and incorporating different ways of engaging with technology, and some educators are a little more hesitant, and some educators are right in the middle. And as such, I think that's part of the major factors that have to be addressed within education as a whole, that the presence of this technology is a factor of life for the modern student. So really the question becomes then, how can mutual common ground be found between educators who may not be accustomed to it and students who have always been accustomed to it?
I feel like, Mia, you're starting to hit on like an epistemological aspect of this. How do we know what we know, and what knowledge do we value? And if students are coming into school, formal schooling, with a whole set of skills of around learning and building knowledge that's so different and technologically based, or culturally based, or both, then they hit the schools and they have a teacher that doesn't recognize this as a valuable way of knowing. I feel like that's kind of like a link that might bind some of these debates and questions and problems together. Instead of as an adult talking about my anxieties with technology or kids these days, if we framed it more in terms of, well, what is valid knowledge to you? And how is that similar and different to what your students consider to be valid knowledge? And how do you acquire it? Some random thoughts.
Interesting perspective, Doug. I think that what I hear you saying is that we should value this idea of student agency and how students learn, and also considering what they feel is important as well. That's not exactly everything you said, but it's part of it.
No, but it's a big part of it. You know, I mean, do we think, you know, you know, of course, there are lots of teachers who value student input and you know, put it at the center of their practice. There are also a lot of teachers who don't, you know, and a lot of that is often driven by the realities of the district and the curriculum and everything else. But I think if we start asking those questions, you know, it's got to hopefully cause some kind of shift.
So in considering this idea of, you know, how does technology change the brain? There are ways in which it changes our brains in terms of, you know, how we think. We use it as a cognitive tool, so to speak. Our brains are wired for using technology. So, and there has been concern throughout the ages for every new technology or different way of learning. There was even concern about when blackboard, a literal chalk blackboard, came into existence, because teachers were worried that if students had their slates with chalk, that they would forget their handwriting skills. So there's always this kind of negotiation of, you know, what does this mean? And as there's a shift towards new technologies, and of course with digital tools and technologies, there's a huge paradigm shift that is forcing us to consider all different ways of learning, different ways of being. What does it mean to learn? How to prepare students for the 21st century, and how to give them ownership of their own learning through just-in-time learning, engaging their passions and interests about learning, and the way that they learn differently, connectedly. There's certainly a lot to think about here. But thinking about it from a science of learning perspective helps us to really frame these questions and consider, well, what makes the difference in the learning environments. So, and it's a huge area of study. Something that I would recommend for folks is, among my resources, there's a very teacher-friendly resource. Well, there are a few, actually. Looking at the science of learning, this is more about the cognitive aspects of learning, the science of learning and development, neuromyths, 9 things that teachers need to learn about learning and the brain. But Marielle Hardiman has developed the brain-targeted teaching model. Which is a really accessible model for teachers, and to ease into the idea of, you know, how do we do this? How do we target, how do we effectively target the brain in teaching and being responsive to our students? And she talks about 6 different areas, and very briefly, the emotional climate, and this could be, you know, feeling safe, but it could also mean attending to the senses the children, introducing novelty to the environment. The physical environment, learning design, which is what we've been talking about through the learning sciences, teaching for mastery as opposed to teaching to cover curriculum, teaching for application, so relevancy, what students are going to use this for, and evaluating learning and seeing if we're being successful, and if not, making changes. So if you have any questions or additional comments, you can contact me at Elkordy. You can take the fun quiz here, and it's so much easier to just access the slide deck. And I don't want to give anybody whiplash here, but I'm going to go back to the URL for the slides. And here are where the slides are accessible. Any final comments? Or it's been a pleasure to engage with you today around this topic, and I really thank you for your time and attention and participation.
Thank you, Angela.
You're
Thank
welcome. You're welcome.
Good,
Thanks
everybody.
so much.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Bye.